Now on ITV1 and later than Build, it's the ITV News.
What future for Gaza over the next few perilous days and way beyond? President Trump hosted a man who could help him with his plan for an American takeover of Gaza, the King of Jordan, who with Egypt would have to agree to taking huge numbers of Palestinian refugees.
Some people say this is ethnic cleansing.
We're moving them to a beautiful location where they have new homes.
While in Washington, the focus was on rebuilding Gaza after the war. In Israel, the Prime Minister backed Trump's call on Hamas to return Israeli hostages by midday Saturday, or the intense fighting will resume. Hamas tonight said it was committed to a ceasefire, blamed Israel for putting its hostage release plan on hold, and rejected the president's plan to move Palestinians out of Gaza. Also tonight, staying in the Oval Office, Musk joins Trump. The world's richest man takes questions for the first time on his role in the White House, saying it's what people voted for. Church of England leaders accused of shocking arrogance after voting against a new plan for fully independent safeguarding.
It will not restore the trust and confidence of victims and survivors who are at the heart of these issues.
A Six Nations scalp in the middle of the tournament. Wales's most successful coach, Warren Gatland, goes again after a 14th loss in a row. And the youngest ever person to receive a blue plaque, and why his death changed the lives of the UK's children.
This is ITV News at 10 with Nina Hossain.
Good evening. It wasn't exactly the welcome Jordan's King Abdullah was hoping for on his visit to the White House. He'd barely arrived before President Trump was trying to strong-arm him into taking in hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from Gaza as Mr. Trump presses on with his plan to remake the Middle East. The president said America was going to have Gaza without paying anything for it, and repeated his determination to redevelop it with hotels and office buildings. He also repeated his threat of yesterday to Hamas to release all the Israeli hostages by Saturday lunchtime, saying he was worried about how weak the three from last weekend had looked. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took up Mr. Trump's refrain. He said if Hamas didn't release Israeli hostages by Saturday, Israel would resume its war on Gaza.
After telling the world America would own Gaza, today President Trump faced one of the Middle Eastern leaders dealing with the fallout.
Are you confident you can get the king on board with your plan for the Palestinian people?
He's a great man, the president said, but those warm words can't disguise the fundamental disagreement he has with King Abdullah over the fate of Gazans.
And thank you very much.
Inside, the king tried his best to remain cordial, even though he's implacably opposed to Trump's plans for Gaza.
How do we make this work in a way that is good for everybody? Right. Obviously, we have to look at the best interests of the United States, of the people in the region, especially to my people of Jordan.
But President Trump is still persisting with the idea America will take over Gaza.
We'll have lots of good things built there, including hotels and office buildings and housing and other things.
And he continued to insist Gazans would be relocated in neighbouring countries.
And I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Jordan. I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Egypt. We may have someplace else, but I think when we finish our talks, we'll have a place where they're going to live very happily and very safely. And, you know, don't forget, they only want to be on the Gaza Strip because they don't know anything else. They never had an alternative. And they don't want to be on the Gaza Strip.
He also reaffirmed his threat to Hamas if it fails to release all hostages by the weekend.
They either have them out by Saturday at 12 o'clock or all bets are off.
Tonight, the prospects of peace look as grim as the landscape in the Gaza Strip. Israel and Hamas both accuse each other of breaching the ceasefire deal. Israeli troops are preparing for renewed combat after their leader echoed Trump's deadline.
The decision I passed unanimously in the cabinet is this. If Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end and the Israeli Defense Forces will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated.
President Trump prides himself on his ability to end wars, not to start them. But his ultimatum to Hamas, enforced by the Israelis, risks reigniting a conflict after months of intense peace negotiations. As King Abdullah left this evening, it was unclear how his differences with his host can be reconciled. Emptying Gaza of its Palestinian population is politically toxic for Jordan, yet that is precisely what President Trump is proposing. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Washington.
The new uncertainty about the ceasefire and Saturday's longed-for releases will pile more distress on the Israeli hostage families. Some are desperate to see their loved ones again. Others are desperate to know whether theirs are even still alive. And for Palestinians in Gaza who hoped the ceasefire would hold, the sense of dread is growing again.
In Tel Aviv's Hostage Square, they cope with the agony of uncertainty by marking every milestone and measuring each moment, not knowing who is alive and who is dead. But the passing of time has rarely felt more painful than now, with the ceasefire hanging by a thread. Harut's son Tamir will only be released if it reaches its second stage. She has no idea of his condition.
There are indications that he didn't make it, but there's no certainty about it. So I'm still hoping and wishing that I will have the same hug and warm feelings when, as the other already received. I have no idea.
Zahi Idan's family understood they were within days of his release, alive or dead. The men who held his family at gunpoint took him after shooting dead his eldest daughter, Mayan. Zaki's cousin in Sussex was about to book a flight. Now he's in limbo and battling despair, particularly after watching these pictures of the most recent hostages to be freed from Gaza, emerging in a shocking condition.
We see them. The most recent released hostages were starving. And I think President Trump is right. They have to be released as soon as possible.
How does Gali and the family get through each day at the moment?
Gali said that she couldn't go back to see Mayan's grave. She can only go back with Zahi, her other half, Mayan's father. And she's waiting for him to come home so that they can go and grieve together properly. But I don't know if she'll even get that chance now.
No one wants to abandon hope, but in Gaza it's now equally hard to hang on to. Looking at the ruins, you can hardly call the past weeks a respite, but at least the bombings stopped. Still, they meet President Trump's threat with derision. My only response to Trump's statement is ha ha ha, says Ayad. Gaza has already witnessed more than hell, more than what Nagasaki and Hiroshima witnessed. And yet we survived and held steadfast. Aid has begun to trickle in, but those bringing it say it's fragile.
We have now improved access to populations who are desperately in need of life-saving services, and we need to maintain that access to the children in Gaza. So any change in this current context would be catastrophic.
On both sides of this conflict, the starting again of hostilities would feel to many like an end to hope. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Can the ceasefire hold after another day of developments, but little sign of progress? John Irvine is in Tel Aviv. The Oval Office talks, they centred around rebuilding Gaza at a time when it feels like it could be plunged back into war.
I'm afraid, Nina, tonight this ceasefire is literally hanging by a thread, and there's not much happening in the way of diplomatic activity to bring it back from the brink of collapse. This crisis was precipitated by Hamas's announcement that it's postponing further hostage releases. The next one was scheduled to take place on Saturday morning and involved the release of 3 more Israeli hostages. Then Donald Trump waded in with issuing this ultimatum that if Hamas do not release all the remaining 76 hostages, then Israel should resume the war. Not surprisingly, the Israeli Security Cabinet met today and they welcomed the Trump ultimatum. The Prime Minister here, Mr. Netanyahu, has issued a statement echoing much of the ultimatum, but there is a crucial difference. He said that if our hostages are not released by midday on Saturday, hostilities will resume. By saying our hostages, Nina, and not specifying a number, it suggests that the Israelis may be satisfied with the release of 3 hostages as envisaged in the original ceasefire deal. But by not specifying a number, the Israelis have decided not to supersede the Trump ultimatum, and it remains preeminent tonight. And the fact of the matter is, Nina, there's a huge gulf between what the President of the United States is demanding and what Hamas are prepared to do.
John, thank you very much. Thank you. After President Trump's talks with Jordan's King Abdullah, which we saw a few moments ago, Mr. Trump caught up with his head of government efficiency, better known as the billionaire businessman Elon Musk. They were together in the Oval Office, where reporters were able to quiz the unelected Mr. Musk about who he is accountable to. Let's return to Dan in Washington. Dan, this is the first time Mr. Musk has faced questions on his new White House role.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the running joke here is that Elon Musk is really the president of the United States in this administration, to the point that Time magazine recently put Elon Musk on its front cover, sitting behind the Resolute desk. Well, this afternoon, we saw Elon Musk holding forth for almost half an hour while President Trump just watched on. Elon Musk at times with his son on his shoulder, explaining his cutting of entire government departments, laying off of thousands of government workers, freezing of budgets, all measures which he says are deeply popular with the US electorate.
The people voted for major government reform. There should be no doubt about that. That was on the campaign. The president spoke about that at every rally. The people voted for major government reform, and that's what people are going to get.
Elon Musk's critics, of course, say he is unelected himself and is going through and taking out spending decisions that have already been approved by Congress, by the Senate, by the House of Representatives, who are elected, that he is eroding the long-standing checks and balances which have been in place in the US for hundreds of years. But there's no doubt tonight, Nina, after this display in the Oval Office, that he is one of the most powerful people in Donald Trump's administration.
Yeah. Dan, thank you very much. Thank you, Dan. Under pressure to offer better protections to victims of sexual abuse, the Church of England's Parliament has decided not to adopt a fully independent safeguarding system, not yet anyway. The General Synod has chosen a semi-independent system instead, church-managed at a local level, independent nationally. The Church's own safeguarding advisor told us the decision will do nothing to restore the confidence of abuse victims in the Church.
Resignation has followed resignation. Scandal has followed scandal. Today, at last, the Church of England confronted its demons.
This must be a watershed moment for the Church.
The Church's Parliament, General Synod, contrite and chastened.
Victims and survivors feel ignored, sidelined, let down, not seen or heard.
We have a malignancy in this church. We have a tumour that needs to be cut away.
But they were divided on the big question: what action to take?
Vote for transparency and accountability. This is our moment to make the Church a safe place for all. Let us not waste it.
What they voted for is a more independent system of safeguarding, but not yet the total transformation.
It's time that the church change and reform.
The victims and survivors who waited patiently outside have campaigned for decades.
Independent safeguarding now.
This is diabolical and outrageous to think that we are speaking up, wishing to be heard, and yet it's coming on deaf ears.
Children are at risk right now, and those people in there don't seem to care about that.
The reforms fall far short of recommendations from the expert the church itself employed to find a way out of the crisis.
It's just extremely disappointing. I honestly expected the church to do the right thing and to consider their conscience. It will not restore the trust and confidence of victims and survivors.
There will be change, but not of the kind that so many victims and survivors have been demanding. And it will take years to implement, leaving some to question whether the church will ever be a safe place.
Isn't this a massive missed opportunity?
And we've failed survivors grievously in the church over many years. We've traumatised and we've re-traumatised them. But what I think would have been disastrous would have been to make promises today, then have to come back to those groups and say, sorry, we couldn't deliver.
Today's meeting was supposed to restore confidence and trust. Instead, it might end up deepening the controversy. John Ray, News at 10 at the General Synod.
London's Metropolitan Police and the High Court are at loggerheads over the force's attempt to get rid of bad officers after a series of terrible scandals, including the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. The force set about re-vetting all its officers and sacking those with accusations against them. Now the High Court has ruled the force can't do that on the strength of accusations alone. The head of the force, Sir Mark Rowley, said it was absurd that it could not sack officers who can't be trusted. The European Union has come out fighting against the tariffs that President Trump whacked on imported steel and aluminium overnight. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said the United States would face reprisals. But the government here, no longer subject to EU rules, said there'd be no knee-jerk reaction.
Cold-finished steel bars, made to order in North Yorkshire for use in cars, aircraft and heavy machinery. Exports to the United States are currently tariff-free, but in 4 weeks' time that will change. Here they worry about a fall in orders and a flood of cheap imports from other countries also shut out of the US.
As well as engaging with US government, it's critical that the UK government does bring in further safeguarding measures to protect the UK steel industry.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is the beginning of making America rich again.
President Trump says tariffs will revive steel making in America. They also push up costs for American manufacturers that use imported steel.
Canada, China and Mexico sell the most steel and aluminium to the United States, and producers there are most exposed to tariffs. By value, the UK is actually the 14th largest importer. The UK steel industry represents just 0.1% of our total economic output, but it employs more than 30,000 people on salaries that are significantly higher than the national average. £363 million of steel was exported to the US last year. That's around 10% of total steel exports. Donald Trump imposed the 25% tariff on steel during his first term as president. The government has since negotiated a series of quotas and exemptions for British producers, but all of these have now been torn up.
Trump fired first, but the EU says it will respond with firm and proportionate countermeasures of its own. In Paris today, tariffs added tension to the first meeting between the President of the European Commission and the Vice President of the United States.
Made in America.
Last time Trump targeted steel and aluminium imports, the UK, then still part of the EU, imposed tariffs on Harley-Davidsons, Levi jeans and Bourbon whiskey.
Minister.
The government response this time may be very different.
What British industry needs and deserves is not a knee-jerk reaction, but a cool and clear-headed sense of the UK's national interest based on a full assessment of all the implications of the US's actions.
Tariffs have the power to unite and divide. British steelmakers find themselves up against it together, but the British government has not joined the EU in threatening reprisals. Who knows which approach, if either, will prove effective? Trump is serious about tariffs. He's also open to doing deals. Joel Hills, News at 10.
When the assisted dying bill passed its first stage in Parliament in that historic vote back in November, there was a majority of more than 50 MPs in favour. But after suggested changes by the bill's backer, Labour's Kim Leadbeater, some MPs are thinking twice about whether they'd vote for it again. Miss Leadbeater wants to remove a promised element, the need for a High Court judge to approve an assisted death.
For some, it had felt like a moment of history when in November the assisted dying bill passed its first stage. But now a key safeguard of the legislation, the role of High Court judges, is already being changed.
There was criticism around the High Court judge, and actually ex-judges said the same thing. They're not quite sure this is the best role for them. So we've listened to them, we've listened to other experts, and I think this model will actually be even more robust than what was proposed at second reading.
Do you understand the concerns of your colleagues, though, who voted, some of whom voted with reservations because they were assured about certain safeguards, and one of those key safeguards was having a High Court judge involved, and now they are thinking, well, it's being dismantled already at this early stage?
Yeah, and that's just not true. I mean, obviously, I've been speaking to colleagues, I've spoken to a lot of colleagues, and actually every single MP I've spoken to about the concept of a multidisciplinary panel has said, oh yeah, that's a really good idea.
The original bill said an assisted death would need sign-off from 2 doctors and a High Court judge. But the new plans replace the judge with an expert panel made up of a psychiatrist, a social worker and a lawyer, with the option of it being reviewed by the High Court only if necessary. Opponents of the bill believe this fundamentally changes what MPs voted on.
This cornerstone of the legislation is being ripped out and replaced by something far weaker, and as a result of that, our confidence in the legislative process as well as the legislation is falling.
Nathaniel Dye, who's terminally ill, has come to Parliament to watch the bill being scrutinised.
As a dying person, I would love for the process to be just as simple as possible. I respect that we need to get this right and experts need to be involved in the process.
And you don't think this waters it down?
I don't think this waters it down at all. I'd say the absolute opposite. I'd say we have more scrutiny of the process. We have more oversight from experts.
The change comes after senior judges told MPs the original plan was unworkable.
It is impossible, in my opinion, for this to be done by the High Court, and it should be done in the Spanish way by a panel set up, a doctor and a lawyer. They have to agree, and they check that everything has been done lawfully.
But opponents of the bill at this committee, which is going through the legislation line by line, have seized on the shift.
There are over 60 colleagues who have stated on the record that they voted for the bill at second reading because of that safeguard. Does she acknowledge that point?
I do acknowledge that point, and absolutely, as I've acknowledged, the role of the judiciary, the role of High Court judge is really important in this process, and that role will remain.
The legislation still has to pass further votes. The question will be whether this late change will now make some MPs change their minds. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
The middle of the Six Nations tournament isn't exactly the best time for any rugby nation to lose its coach, but Wales's Warren Gatland is on his way again. It was unlikely he would survive after losing the supposedly unlosable fixture against Italy at the weekend, especially as Wales had already lost their previous 13 matches.
Even before the game, his body language said it all. After a record 14th defeat in the rain in Rome, Warren Gatland's departure felt inevitable. After days of rumours, confirmation he has left his position as head coach.
Up till now, Warren has always felt that he was the right person to make that change and to take the team forward. You know, he no longer felt that, and when that happens, then you've got to look for a new solution.
That solution, albeit temporary, is Cardiff Rugby's current head coach, who somehow needs to motivate a squad void of form and morale for the final 3 games of the Six Nations.
It's going to be very difficult to change a huge amount technically and tactically in what will probably be 4 sessions before we play Ireland, but I do think we can get like a mindset shift and a real excitement to play international rugby for Wales.
For the man he's replacing, it's a sad end to an illustrious career.
Now 10 wins in a row for Wales.
Warren Gatland led Wales to a remarkable 3 Grand Slams. That's equal to what reigning champions Ireland have managed in the entire history of the Six Nations, and won more than England.
They have beaten the host nation.
There was success at World Cups too, including this famous victory at Twickenham. In Cardiff today, opinions were split.
He did brilliant when he first started, when he first took over Wales. Got us that golden era, brilliant. But coming back was the right decision. Who knows?
The players are all very young, aren't they? They're inexperienced, that's the problem. People expect too much.
It's a bit like football managers. I don't think it's ever the same when you return. So I think on the balance, he's done great things in the past, but I think it is the right decision, yeah.
Wales's national game is in rapid decline. Grassroots clubs are struggling for players, while the 4 professional teams are struggling to compete with bigger spending rivals. The concern among many within Welsh rugby is that it will take much more than a new head coach to deal with the deeper problems within the national game. His return was meant to be a fairy tale sequel, but as the Gatland era draws to a close, it's not clear how his eventual successor will turn things around. Rhys Williams, News at 10, Cardiff.
To a sporting hero from a different era now, and there was no doubting the place of Denis Law in the footballing firmament, judging by the calibre of players past and present at his funeral. The hearse carrying the Manchester United and Scotland striker rolled past the Old Trafford Stadium, scene of so many of the victories he inspired. At the service at Manchester Cathedral, current United players, including Harry Maguire and Bruno Fernandes, were joined by legends, including Gary Neville, Sir Kenny Dalglish and Sir Alex Ferguson. Finally, the ending of child labour and the beginning of compulsory education for children were monumental events in Victorian Britain. Today, a blue plaque went up on a building just outside Cambridge to commemorate someone whose hard life and early death helped bring about both. He was only 11, the youngest person to have one of the plaques. George Brewster was a chimney sweep.
They're often portrayed as happy-go-lucky. Mary Poppins responsible for this romantic view of the chimney sweep. But behind the real smog-filled skies of England's cities was the dark reality of climbing boys, or children forced to clean chimneys.
That wasn't an unusual story for children in the Victorian era. Lots of children were either, down mines, up chimneys, in factories, working on farms, and in fact 40% of the workforce of that time was under 18.
His name may be on a blue plaque now, but in 1875 George Brewster was an unremarkable 11-year-old. Owned by a chimney sweep master, he had to clamber up flues for his keep. George was forced by his master to climb and clean a chimney of a boiler house that once stood in front of this building. But 15 minutes into his climb, he got stuck. They did pull a wall down as they tried to rescue him, and they did get him out, but he died shortly after. George was to be Britain's last climbing boy. For decades, MP and social reformer, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, had been campaigning to ban the practice. Then, just 7 months after George's death, he was finally successful.
He used the real life stories, brought that to the House of Commons and the Lords, and made the sort of seriousness of that story come to life. And it was obviously that was the last moment, if you like, where people finally said, right, no, we've really got to change this.
5 years later, school then became compulsory for all children, saving thousands of lives.
Time for the big unveiling.
Now exactly 150 years on from his death, George has become the youngest person to be commemorated with a blue plaque, and it's already inspiring other young Georges.
When I read about him, I instantly thought
I want to change the world like he did.
George Brewster, the ordinary boy with an extraordinary legacy. Charlie Frost, News at 10.
And that's it for tonight. Thanks for staying up from all of us. Good night, or even good morning.